Okay, good morning everyone. Great to see you all in on the webinar. Welcome to this dissertation session on editing. My name is Chris. You can see my picture up there on the screen, and I'm joined by my colleague here.
Hi everyone, my name's Ruth.
And we work in the Careers and Employability Centre, and our job is really to work with students and writers on their dissertations, and so that's what our aim is today. We did a little sound check earlier. We'd appreciate it if a few of you could just confirm now that you can hear okay as we're speaking. Great. Fantastic. Okay, brilliant. So let me just explain how this session is going to work. I'll move to the next slide. We're going to introduce a 5-stage editing model to you. So that's an example of what you can do as you come to edit your dissertation. We'll touch on some key editing tips, and then there'll be time at the end for questions. So please make a note of those and feel free to write them in at the end of the session. You can download the slides and the handout we'll be showing you at the end of the session as well, so don't worry about that. And just to let you know that we're also part of the Skills Hub website, so that contains a lot of resources as well for your work.
Yeah, on the PowerPoint there are links to that, so you'll be able to find those easily afterwards. Okay, so we'd just like to give you a definition of editing. You can see up there on the screen the broad intellectual task of raising the overall academic standard of a piece of writing via an iterative process of critique and revision. So just thinking about that, there's a few words I just want to highlight. Overall is quite important because we want to ensure that we are focusing on the whole piece of work, and that's really going to help raise the standard by not just looking at certain parts but overall checking. And this idea of an iterative, a repeated process, a cycle, is very important as well. So there might be times when you start editing quite early on a little bit, and then later on you might do some more and keep coming back to it. So it is a continuous process, and that's really going to help improve the standard of your work. And just another point to mention is we're not just talking about proofreading, we're not just checking spelling and grammar. We're going to go through the whole process of how you can edit in a very thorough way. So this is the model that we're going to be using to explain the editing process. And as you can see, there are 5 stages. So we're going to take you through these one by one. And as you can see, it's through using this model you're able to focus on different aspects of editing and really ensure that you cover all you need to cover and get your work up to that good standard that you want.
Okay, so let's think about the first stage in the model. And of course we know some of you will be at different stages in your writing and editing process, but hopefully this is something that could be useful later in the process, whichever stage you're at. So the first part of editing, perhaps, is to focus on the academic rigour. So not focusing on small items such as spelling and grammar. Instead, the first time you do an editing stage, you're really focused on the key ideas. And the underlying principle for this is reading as a critic. Just give yourself an opportunity to question absolutely everything in your work. It doesn't mean you can necessarily resolve all those questions, but by giving yourself a day or even a morning to just ask questions of your work, even before you go into the details of the editing process. In particular, you want to highlight any hidden assumptions in your work. Have you assumed that the key concepts you outline are defined, for instance? On this slide, we've got a few suggestive questions. And actually, as you can see, they're quite basic. But the point is, at this early stage in editing, you do want to ask yourself these big picture questions. What did you try to achieve in your dissertation? Did you do it? What were you trying to say, and did you say it? And crucially, for this academic writing process, Do you provide sufficient evidence to support your arguments? Answering that question will help you work out how to frame your arguments. Are the sections in the best order? And is the structure within those chapters, within those sections, in the best order as well? So we suggest that you focus on these big picture items before you go any further with the editing process. Let's take a look at an example paragraph. So this is an extract from a published piece of work in an academic journal. Take a moment to read through it and just think, is there anything you notice in that paragraph about the big picture, about the communication of key ideas? Is there anything you could suggest, particularly at the start of the paragraph, to change? I'll just give you a moment to have a think about that. Okay, so you've had a chance just to have a quick look at that. On the next slide, we've made a suggestion for how this paragraph could be improved in terms of academic rigour. Here you can see in green some additions or highlights. So first, the adding the topic sentence element. So this is a key and very straightforward policy you can have. You look through your work and you think, is my first sentence communicating the overall point of this paragraph? You may then also want to highlight other key moments in the paragraph where you're actually explaining to the reader what your argument is and what your logical reasoning is. We actually do recommend you use simple tools like highlighting your own work in the way that you highlight important things in journal articles, because this can really help you isolate the key ideas. In that first sentence, we're told what the point of the paragraph is. Later down in the second highlighted part, you're explicitly telling the reader that this is significant for your overall argument. And finally, there's a concluding sentence to tie the paragraph's key idea together. So that's just a small example of the first stage of editing. Just go through those paragraphs and think, where are my key ideas? Where's my key argument?
Okay, so the next stage now is reducing and adding. So this is where you are making those little adjustments to just improve the overall argument and think about how you're conveying your ideas in a clear way. This is also very important for ensuring that you're meeting your word count. So if you have a particular word count that you have to stick to, then you may just be slightly over, perhaps you've got 100 words too much, and you're going to have to look throughout your work to see where you can cut out those extra words. So some of the areas you can look at are excessive description. Obviously, you might need to describe, for example, a particular theory or some research, but do you need to go into every detail of that? It might be possible that you could make it more concise, leave out details that aren't necessary. Another error that we sometimes make is we get particularly interested in something and go off on a tangent, and it might be very well written, but is it really relevant to the overall theme, the overall argument? So if there are any parts when you're reading through and you think, well, that does take me off track slightly, does it add or does it just distract? If it distracts, then perhaps just remove it. Additionally, there could be just extra words. Sometimes we write in the same style that we speak. When we're speaking, that's fine because we can adjust and the other person's listening and we can add those extra words that we want. When we're writing, we don't want to have any of these extra words. We want it to be very clear, concise, and to the point. So that's another area that you can check and just remove those extra parts that aren't really needed. Additionally, we might look through our work and see, well, actually, we haven't explained an idea clearly. So this is where you want to perhaps add a bit more information. And that's where, if you've done the cutting out, you perhaps have allowed a bit of your word count to be used to add to other sections. So always in our work we want to ensure that we're giving thorough analysis. So cutting out description but adding analysis is something that is always going to be beneficial. Thinking about the implications, perhaps, have we considered that? And not just talking about all the positive things, but also the limitations, the disadvantages of some research or a particular theory. That might be a way of adding to the depth, and that's going to really help improve your work and perhaps just boost your marks a little bit. So we're going to have a look at an example here as well. So again, this extract, just have a look through, scan the work, just give you a moment to do that. See if there's anything that stands out. Obviously it's difficult to do in a short period of time, but just have a little scan through and see if there's anything that you think you would cut out or change in any way. Okay, so let's have a look at the next example. So this is what we considered that we would cut out. So this sentence, as you can see, has so the suggestion is that that would be removed. Why? Well, basically because it can be removed and still the paragraph flows well, makes sense, the point is still clear. So that's what you always want to look at. If you take it out, have you disconnected the two parts? Is it still clear? Does it still make sense? Often when we're writing, we repeat ourselves. So there are often parts that we can just remove and it's still perfectly fine. Also, you notice that the word will has been changed to may. This is something that's very important in academic writing. We don't really want to be dogmatic. We want to be tentative because often we are talking about the application of theories, the implications of findings, and it's not always 100%. Generally, it's not 100%. So we want to use these words like may, might, could, perhaps. So that's something to look out for in your work, and that's really going to add again to the academic style.
Okay, so let's move on to the third section. So we've looked at the big ideas, we've looked at what we need to remove, what we need to add, and now you can move on to ensuring consistency for what you do have on the paper. The first bullet point is so important. What are the key words and the key concepts in your dissertation? I recommend you have a list for yourself of 10 to 20 of these key important words or concepts, and have for yourselves clearly stated definitions. It may be that you use these definitions in your writing, or maybe not, but just to make sure that throughout your work these very important moments are always consistently stated. Then you have other aspects of consistency. Depending on the requirements of your field, you may be writing in the first person or the third person. What kind of tenses are you using? When do you use past tense? When do you use present tense? That's an inconsistency that readers of dissertations often see. Formatting. That can seem like quite an unimportant thing maybe at this stage, but how is your page organised? What are the margins? What are the requirements of your school? That's something actually you can do quite early in the process, because you don't want to have to change those margins later in the process, as that can mess with your page numbers or mess with where your figures appear. The consistency of how you present tables, figures, appendices, and then of course how you present references is also important in this. What we're aiming to achieve through this editing process is to anticipate things that might irritate the reader. The reader will notice if things like this are inconsistent, and they will appreciate it if you've tackled these issues before they get to read your work. So let's look at an example, and if you could try and find one or two inconsistencies in this paragraph, take a moment to do that and then we'll check in. Okay, let's take a look at what's in this paragraph that perhaps shouldn't be. Some of you may have noticed the classic referencing inconsistency. In this case, there's a page number stated, in the other case there isn't. And an important one is, in this second sentence, indeed Walker states that reflection is thus meta-thinking. That's ensuring consistency between what Walker is saying and how Sanders is asserting. That's quite a common inconsistency in academic writing that you want to avoid. And then finally, towards the bottom of the page, in this case, the author has written, "We've started to think." Now, depending on your academic field, you may express that in a different way. The point here is to be consistent in how you use your position throughout your work. Okay, so that's the third stage, consistency. Let's move to the next one, signposting. And again, you'll notice that we're leaving some of these things until after you've checked the key ideas are expressed. So in the signposting, there are some obvious points, such as outlining your content, perhaps outlining your argument in your introduction, brief introductions and conclusions to each chapter or each section, and then explicit links between chapters and sections. Where are you going to indicate to the reader how these things merge together? Finally, at which points will you refer to your literature? You may do this throughout your work, and you'll benefit from having a think about where and how you refer to the literature, even after the literature review, if you have one of those. Let's take a look at an example. As you can see here, our paragraph is introducing the chapter, and then towards the bottom of the page you can see the next sections that are coming. So actually we're going to move straight on to how you can signpost here. If I move to the next slide, it's as simple as adding in explicit signposts at the end of this first paragraph in the section. Now, you may have different ways of doing this, but one thing we recommend is that as part of this editing process, you go through your work and you highlight each moment where you signpost for the reader. Highlight it in green or some other way, and that can really help you see on the page how things are signposted in your work.
Alright, so final stage would be perhaps a day or two before you hand in, you might just want to go through and check some of these key points. Particularly the details like repeated words and spelling and punctuation, grammar, extra spaces, these sort of things that are quite minor, you can do in a quite relaxed way, but they just add to the overall quality of your work. So again, we've got an example here, just give you a moment to have a look through. And see if you can find, there's actually 5 errors, 5 points that we think could be improved. So see if you can find those. Okay, so let's have a look at these points. So as you can see here, metacognition, there's a dash and then later on there isn't, so consistency there is important. Some other points you can see with the spelling, Between and Sanders, there's a gap, so just tidying that space up. Metacognition is twice there, so one of those would have to be removed. So as you can see, there's just a few little errors that that we've identified, and that's a sort of process that you can go through with your final proofreading stage.
And I'll add there that it's great to leave this stage right to the end, because you don't want to waste time on it in case you end up deleting whole sections.
Exactly, yeah, you could spend a lot of time on a paragraph and then find it's not really relevant and removed it. So always try and think about using your time effectively. And this is the published paragraph after all those different stages of editing have been done. You might find some other things in this paragraph that you would change. That's perfectly fine. It's always possible to do a bit more, perhaps write something in a slightly different way. But obviously, you're working to a deadline. You have to hand in your work at a certain point. So we get to a stage in our editing where we just decide that's good enough. We can never have everything perfect, and it's always possible to change things. So you have to be aware as well that there are going to be points where you just have to stop. You can't do any more.
Okay, so just to summarise that briefly, we do recommend you edit in stages. Don't try and do everything at once. Instead, try to target what you're trying to edit each time. Secondly, you can adapt this 5-point model to your own needs. And thirdly, of course, the key part of editing is allowing sufficient time for you to edit in a calm way. So we're going to move to the questions phase now. So if you have questions about what we've just discussed or other editing questions for your dissertation, please feel free to write them in the chat box. While some of those questions are coming through, I'll just indicate a few additional resources you could use. So of course the Skills Hub website has quite a lot of material on there, and also links to other writing websites which may be useful, like the Royal Literary Fund. We also recommend you take a look at the Sussex Library subject guides. You can find that on the library website. The library is also running workshops and webinars, particularly for master's students this summer, so that may be of interest. The IT department also do workshops for you, and again, we recommend you think about that as you plan the next few weeks. And finally, for those of you who are looking for language support, ELAS and the Language Centre have some great resources, actually physically on campus, but also online through Canvas.
Okay, so we're getting some questions coming in now, Chris. So we've got a question here. How many days would you suggest for editing? Would 4 days be sufficient? What do you think about that?
I think my starting point would be that yes, 4 days may give you time to do most of those phases, but ideally you'd be looking for at least a week. But I'll add something, which is that you don't want to be editing only yourself. It would be a great idea to ask a friend or a family member or a colleague to read part of your work and to get their feedback. And you don't have to give them the whole dissertation. You may even just choose to ask them to read maybe a key paragraph or even a key sentence, and ask this other person, are you clearly communicating?
Yeah, I think that's important, and especially things like the introduction and the conclusion, because those are things we often struggle over. If you're worried about things like the other person sort of inputting your work and it not being your own, then obviously they can't tell you how to change it, but they could suggest or indicate to you whether or not it makes sense. That's really what I'd ask them to do. You know, is this clear to you? Do you understand what I'm saying? If not, why not? Then obviously they're not going to edit the work. You have to go off and do your editing, but at least having that input from somebody can be really helpful. And things like spelling and grammar, there's nothing wrong with someone else pointing those things out, because that's not to do with content. Especially, you know, if you do find those things difficult, it can be great to have someone else's eye look at your work.
So just as we're waiting for more questions to come in, a couple of small tips. One is, despite the age we live in fact, printing out your work can have a remarkable effect on your ability to see things you didn't see on screen. So we do recommend you print out your work, if possible.
I would agree with that. Just printing it out, go somewhere quiet, sit down on a sofa, for example, with a pen, pencil, go through your work, and it's amazing how the errors and the things you want to change just come out. So that's a great way to do that. We've got another question. Yes, we will be sending the recording and the slides. We're going to put up a link, I think, now.
Yeah, in fact, we'll respond straight to that. So we're going to put up, you see in the centre of your screen now, you can actually download both the editing handout, which has the 5-point model on it, and also the slides. Okay, so you can do that anytime. We'll also send you an email afterwards with those resources. A question from Rebecca on the literature review and how to interact with the literature review throughout the paper. Now, of course, this will depend on which field you're in. So the starting point would be to look at a model of a dissertation or even another piece of work written in your field and see how they do it. But in general, something that students worry about is repeating things. So they've made certain points in the literature review and they're worried that if they return to those points in another section, that will be seen as unnecessarily repetitive. I think the overall message is sometimes an element of repetition can be helpful if it's relevant to the argument for each section. So in the discussion chapter, there will probably be opportunities to point out to the reader, here's what I've discovered in my results, and here's how they help us better understand the content given what we previously saw in the literature.
Yeah, just to add to that, say that in scientific disciplines, you tend to just refer to the literature in your discussion, whereas in humanities, it's quite normal to keep referring back to it and making links right the way through. Would you agree, Chris?
Yes, I think that's right. Yeah.
We've got another question here about past tenses and present tenses. Do you just use those according to whether you agree with somebody or not, or what is it to do with? Is that correct?
Yeah, it's a good question, Yuki. As always, the answer is it depends. One thing we pointed out earlier in the example was if you're referring to literature as a current debate, a debate that's in play, then you typically would use the present tense. If you're providing an example of previous positions, you can use the past tense. So I think you're on the right lines there, Yuki, with that. But again, the most important thing is the consistency throughout your dissertation of how you deal with this. You do have some autonomy over how you write as an academic writer, but the key thing is consistency. I'm not actually familiar with that tip that you mentioned, but that certainly could make sense in certain subjects.
I think I'd be careful of doing that, rather than basing it on your view, whether you agree or not. I think I'd follow what Chris said more about whether it's a current debate or it's something that has occurred in the past.
Okay, great. So we've got a couple more questions possibly coming in. If you do have any questions, please send them in now, and we'll do our best to touch on them.
Yeah, something that I know students do sometimes worry about is when should you start editing. We have touched on that, but just to sort of emphasise, it is good to get some work down. Don't start editing too early on, because as we mentioned, you can waste a lot of time, but also you can become a bit of a perfectionist if you're always worrying about every single sentence you put down. The initial writing process should just be quite free. Don't worry about your grammar, punctuation, just get information down. Even if you just start describing something and then go into the analysis later on, that's fine. You've got something to work with. It's much more important to have work written, get it all done, then you can start that editing cycle.
Yeah, that's a great point, Ruth. Liberate yourselves to just write freely. because you know you can be confident you'll do this editing process later. So just final call for any questions. There's possibly one still coming in. What we'll do is we'll send an email to you all afterwards, and again that'll note the resources we have. And you're also welcome to get in touch anytime via the Skills Hub website.
Yeah, and we have got a big section on writing, editing, dissertations on Skills Hub, so have a look at that, and I'm sure you'll find that very useful.
Okay, so we're going to leave it there. When it's suggested to start writing the dissertation, actually we recommend you start writing as soon as possible, even if it's only in this very liberated, free form. One thing we always recommend in our workshops is to maybe write down your abstract or table of contents now and just keep adapting that as you move forward. Yeah,
and I think definitely as you're reading, write about what your thinking is about the things you're reading. So writing, reading, thinking, these can all go hand in hand. You don't have to do loads of reading, then have a writing stage. I think doing both at the same time is a great process. And if you just keep in mind, as Chris said, that it doesn't have to be perfect at the start, that's going to help you just get some information down.
Okay, so just a couple of quick responses and then we'll have to come to a close. But just on the word count, one thing that is sometimes a useful model is 10% for introduction, 10% conclusion, and then divide from there of your body paragraphs. But that will depend on your field. Again, experiment with different ways you could divide your work, and maybe that will make things clearer.
Yeah, definitely have a look again at the guidance on your particular school website, your school page. Talk to your tutors. See, as Chris mentioned earlier, examples of other dissertations and see the writing style that's used. And that's going to help you a lot in writing your own work.
Great. And then a good question from Anne. I think the answer is, with this again question of tenses, have a look in your field how they tend to do it. I wouldn't like to give a clear rule in response to that, but see what other people in your field do. Who is a writer who writes about Marx in this case that you admire? How do they do it? And then decide on your policy and stick to it. As long as it's logical and the reader can clearly follow what the purpose is, this is the kind of thing you don't want to be too bogged down on and keep focused on the bigger picture.
Yeah, I think that's very important. These are details, and it can be frustrating because we often want clear guidelines, but there is possibility for variation in academic writing, so be aware of that.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to come to a close. Regarding the structure question, yes, I think on Skills Hub there are some suggestions there, but with all of these things, you are all working in slightly different contexts, you're from different subjects, and so do feel confident to really see what the writing models are in your subject area. Pick the writer you admire, see how they do it, and then consider adapting that into your work.
Yeah, and unless you're writing a scientific report or a particular business report generally, there is scope for variation, so you don't have to feel tied down to one particular way.
Great, okay, so we're going to finish there. Thanks very much for joining us, and good luck with your writing and editing.
Yeah, good luck.